Greetings, beloved of God. Now recently, I saw a video of a certain gentleman by the name of Muslim Cowboy, and he was making this objection against Christianity that Christ, based on the fact that there was a curse in the book of Jeremiah against Jehoiakim on his descendants, that it would actually have an impact or it would affect the kingship of the Lord Jesus Christ. So let's see.
What's up, babe?
Hey, so was Jesus supposed to inherit David's throne?
Well, according to Luke, so said the angel.
Okay, because I thought in Matthew, Jesus was a descendant of Jehoiakim.
Okay, and?
But Jeremiah 36:30 says that Jehoiakim and all his descendants are cursed by God and they're not going to sit on David's throne.
Okay, now that you've watched that video, you've seen the objection that the brother is bringing up. But now, by the grace of God, I want to address some few points concerning those very objections and how they have no impact whatsoever on the kingship of Christ. So point number 1. Now, the curse was issued on Jehoiakim. It was issued on his descendants. It was issued on his descendants. It was not issued on the generations that were going to follow after him. So it was released against his descendant, meaning his own children. And now the curse does not extend past his children. So that is point number 1 that I want us to address. It doesn't affect the generations that follows after. Now, why am I saying this? It is because there were kings that followed after Jehoiakim. That would in itself prove that the curse could not affect the generations that followed after the descendants of Jehoiakim. Now, one example is Zedekiah. Now, and the second example is the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, these are the people who took charge of the temple. They ruled the temple. So, they had power, some sort of power over the people of the Jews. So, if that were true, that the curse would affect every generation that followed after Jehoiakim, then we couldn't have found kings after Jehoiakim. Now, one example, the second example that I want to present to us is Zerubbabel. Now, Zerubbabel rose up in a kingly position. So, if the curse would mean that there would be no other king that would come after Jehoiakim, then we couldn't have had people like Zerubbabel. That is point number 1. Now, point number 2 is that the curse was issued on the promise of the Messiah, of a king to reign in the seat of David, was given to David and not Jehoiakim. So whatsoever Jehoiakim did with his own life had no impact on a promise given to someone else. It is like God gives you a promise and your child messes up. How would that affect the promise that God has given unto you? It doesn't. If you look at it critically, it doesn't, because the promise was made to David. It was not made to Jehoiakim. So whatsoever Jehoiakim did with his life had no impact on the promise that was given to David. Now, point number 3. Now, we can see that prophets prophesied after the curse was issued. What would that imply? It would imply that the curse had no impact on the promise of the Messiah. So the curse that was released on Jehoiakim had no impact. Why? Because the prophets already knew. Because had they not known, they could not have prophesied after the curse was issued. Meaning, we can say it logically that the curse wouldn't affect the Messiah, and the prophet themselves knew about it. Why am I saying so? It is because they prophesied after. Let's say the prophet Zechariah. The prophet Zechariah comes after the curse was issued. So by him prophesying about the Messiah, some few years after the curse was issued, that means that the curse had no impact on the Messiah. So I'm here to present to us those very few points, that the curse of Jehoiakim had no impact on the Messiah Jesus. Now the last point that I want to make is that the promise that was given to David was an everlasting promise. It was an everlasting promise. Now what does that mean? It means that it is not affected by the conduct of those whom God gives the promise to. Now, it was an everlasting promise. If you look at 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse number 16, we can see that God uses such terms as forever. Now, forever means everlasting. It means that the promise that was released, the promise that was given to David, the promise that was given to King David was an everlasting covenant. It was an everlasting promise. So, individual failures or mistakes has no impact on an everlasting covenant. So, the covenant was issued in the terms that is going to be fulfilled despite what the people that came between David and the Messiah did. Now, this is what God says. God says that if his children do go astray or make a mistake, he is going to punish them. So that is what the condition that God gave. And that condition had no impact on the Messiah. Because if someone makes a mistake, God punishes that very person. He does not take away his promise, which he had given to his servant David. So that is the last point that I wanted to address, that it was the promise of the Messiah was an everlasting covenant. It was an everlasting promise. That means it cannot be annulled by the action of an individual. So I believe that has helped someone. God bless you. Shalom.